convincing people after doing economics that I could actually cook. Ended up being an executive chef running restaurants. And one day, I'm in Santa Barbara, and two of my surfing buddies who are fisheries scientists come to me and say, you know, this is a huge problem out there, and we need to do something about it. And we have some ideas. So they came to my restaurant, and they gave me this presentation, and this is kind of what you're talking about when you sort of see the eyes glaze over. I saw all these diagrams and graphs of fisheries and collapsings and math equations that look similar to economics, but not exactly. I had no clue what these people were saying to me. And they walked out, and all I knew is after an hour that there was an issue and that I was buying and selling thousands of pounds of the products that were causing the issue. But beyond that, whatever these people were saying was completely intelligible to the people who were actually doing it. So we teamed up, and we actually created a program in California that helps retail buyers sort out all this information and actually capitalize on it. We were realizing that in California specifically, people cared, and they were going to companies and asking questions, and if they couldn't answer the questions, they were losing sales. So we turned that into a program that helped all those companies actually benefit from it. So from then, we came up with the idea of fishchoice.com, which is what I currently do now. And it's a website, I'd say don't go there, because unless you want a container of shrimp, it's not really going to do you any good. It's a website intended to connect commercial buyers and sellers of sustainable seafood products. And what we do is we muddle through the science and information that comes from the global NGO communities about seafood products, and we figure out what they're actually trying to say. You know, what they're saying is the most sustainable, what they're saying is the worst, and we find companies that actually do it. So a real world example, since I'm assuming most of you are from Colorado. I'm from Colorado as well now. So a direct example from a couple months ago is Jack's Seafood Restaurants wanted to find a new source for fresh prawns, and they used our website to find a company out of Northern California where they could actually source them directly from. So we're just trying to connect that level of the industry together to make life a little bit easier for them. So the role I've gotten myself into, I spent the last 12 years basically been at the intersection of the science and the actual markets that are doing this. So with that, I kind of, because my background isn't in the science, I've had to figure out how to distill this into very, very simple talking points for myself so I can talk to the people who I deal with. So really simply, when I talk about sustainable seafood, the question is, why should I care? And the first one is, and kind of one of those alarming things, every time I see the graphs, it shocks me a little bit, that global catch is largely leveled off since the mid-'80s. And if you think to yourself, if every single other part of your life, how much technology has advanced it, I mean, everything from TVs to cars, the fishing industry has seen all of that technology and more, but we still have the same catch we have from the mid-'80s, which means there's less fish in the sea. It's one of those fairly obvious things. You take a bucket of apples and you ask me to bob for apples. If there's 15 in there, I'm going to get one. If there's 3, it's going to take a lot more effort until I do get one. The other point, which David actually largely laid out for, is the aquaculture is the fastest growing sector in the food industry right now. Last year in North America, it eclipsed wild seafood as far as our consumption goes, and globally, aquaculture is larger than the beef industry. And that's largely because places like China have been farming fish for thousands and thousands of years. It's largely new in the developed world. And the large point, as David also pointed out, world population is not going down. So we need sources of healthy protein for people to consume. So I'm going to take wild fish and farm fish, and I'm going to sort of parse them out into the very, very simple points so that it's a little more easy to conceptualize, which you can develop your own questions that you want to ask when you decide what is sustainable and what is not. So when we look at wild fish, you start with, are there enough and are we catching them too fast? You know, generally speaking, you look at a population before we start to fish it. Are there enough there that when we start to catch these fish, the population isn't just going to just disappear? That also goes along with, are we catching them too fast? Every type of species of fish in every population reproduces at a different rate. Some are very fast, some are very slow. You catching from the fast reproducing systems, they're going to replenish themselves much more quickly. You take an anchovy fishery, it's going to replenish itself much faster than a bluefin tuna fishery is. Therefore, it's going to be able to handle a much, much higher level of fishing pressure. So once we've finished looking at the stock itself, we then look at, does catching them impact other species? Now, there's a thing in the seafood industry called bycatch, and bycatch is largely the catching of other species that you're not intending to catch while you're fishing for a specific species. And the numbers are somewhat staggering. There's some shrimp fisheries that we've seen upwards of 10 pounds of other things caught for every 1 pound of shrimp. But you think about it, it's largely just a complete waste of resources. It's actually a waste of efficiency of the fishery, so they have every reason to try and eliminate it because it's actually wasting them money too. We've also seen numbers as high as saying 40% of total global catch is actually bycatch. So of all the extra energy that we're putting out there to catch these fish, 40% of that is not being used, and most of it returns either dead or dying. Apologize for the sort of Grim Reaper approach of the seafood industry, but it's largely true. And then the last thing we look at is, does catching them impact habitat as a whole? Now, one of the common ways of catching large amounts of fish is called trawling, which is basically huge nets up to 100 yards wide, which just sweep through the ocean and essentially catch everything. And some of those do come in contact with the bottom of the sea and do impact corals and other places that small fish are using as their hatchery grounds, and it's basically killing the substrate that is used by a lot of these species to actually grow. So when we look at aquaculture, there's really only two major things we look at, and it's essentially what goes in and what comes out. And as David really well laid out with these recirculating systems, it's very easy to control that in certain situations about exactly what's going in and what comes out. But essentially what we're looking at from farming a fish is what goes in is the feed or any kind of drugs or anything like that you have to use to grow that product. And you looking across the spectrum of aquaculture, we ranch bluefin tuna now, which can use anything up to 15 pounds for every 1 pound of bluefin tuna. But then on the other side, we see some of the things that David pointed out to us of tilapia farms that are at a point of 1-to-1, which is actually, that's a pretty good use of our resources to create products for mankind. And the other major thing is what comes out. So we're looking at across the board, whether it's on land, whether it's recirculating, whether it's a net pen, we have effluent. There's a lot of poop. Where's the poop going, essentially? Diseases, David pointed out also with a recirculating system, you can't 100% prevent disease outbreaks when you're farming fish. So if you're farming them in the ocean, as the net pens that David was pointing out, it's a little bit like a kindergarten. So you send your kid to the kindergarten and he's sick, and then everyone else in the kindergarten gets sick because they're intensely packed into these little rooms together. So then you walk past that playground and then you get sick too because you got all these little kids running around with little diseases. Well, that's basically exactly what happens in the net pen type of farming, which is pretty prevalent all over the world at this point. And we also have habitats. When we talk about what comes out, some of that is the impacts where we actually put the farms. Was this farm put somewhere where we had to clear cut mangrove forests and stick a shrimp farm in that then creates an environment that you actually can't farm in anymore? So a couple of years ago when we were looking at this and talking to people about the difference between wild and farmed, I kind of got to toggle back between the two, you start to realize that the issues are completely different. And it's really unfortunate, and I'm sort of hoping this is a new way for everyone to think about sustainable seafood issues as a whole, is that wild fish are, it is the last commercial hunting that we do. It's the only thing on this planet that we commercially hunt for human consumption. And that in itself has impacts that no other food system has. We're essentially wiping out species. We're wiping out parts of our biodiversity by hunting certain species too heavily. You're talking about the bluefin tuna. There's a chance it will go extinct because, to be honest, the Japanese won't stop buying it. It's so good. We can't create global laws in place to stop that fishery from pretty much disappearing. And when the bluefin tuna goes, that has impacts on both sides of the food web. So it's part of an intricate spider web of ecosystem services. And when one that point goes, it eliminates a lot of different parts as well. And the truth is, we really don't know what happens. Then you go back to farming fish, and really none of those issues are there. It's all what goes in and what comes out, which is exactly the same as farming beef or pork or chicken. So it's hard to sell comparing one against the other. And it's hard because they're in the same case together. It's hard not to do that. But in reality, we shouldn't be comparing farm salmon to wild salmon. We should be comparing wild salmon to bluefin tuna, and we should be comparing farm salmon to beef. Because the realities are, we're talking about using natural resources, or at least resources that we have on this planet, to create food for human consumption when we're talking about farming fish. In the wild aspects, we're talking about saving our biodiversity of our planet. So as an environmental community, we've been starting to push this conversation. Part of it's out of funding, because we're running out of funding to work on the oceans issues, so we're thinking some of these ag people should probably be funding the aquaculture work as well. But it's also just realizing this industry is growing so fast, and fundamentally, when we're making these choices, we shouldn't be eliminating farmed products that are actually a hell of a lot better for us than farming some of the other species that we're farming, again, such as cows, such as pigs. And the realities are, a lot of these farming methods and some of the things that we tout as the worst possible aquaculture systems are largely better than the status quo when it comes to other terrestrial farming products. So it's kind of a long-winded way of supporting David's point of we're all getting the stink eye from certain environmental organizations when we say that we really support aquaculture. But again, the realities are, as food systems go, it's the fastest growing. It's a very efficient way of creating healthy protein for human consumption. In many cases, it's very affordable. And again, you look at places like China, they've been doing it for thousands of years. So, I largely talked through these two slides. In the end of the day, in my opinion, we should be looking at not at talking about seafood, we should be talking about farming food versus hunting for food. And to me, if that conversation can be driven in that direction, I think it's going to lead to a lot more interesting aquaculture systems and a lot more relief on some of the wild capture systems that we look at. So general advice, again, people are often asking, like, what's a simple question I can ask? As David pointed out, you need multiple PhDs, or in my case, 12 years working in this environmental movement to actually have a slightest idea about what you're doing when you're going to buy something, and I still use a seafood watch card. So the reality is, as David said, farm is not bad. Some people will disagree with you. In some cases, it is bad. But in the generic sense of the term, farming seafood is not a bad idea. It's taking some pressure off of the oceans and creating some very good protein sources for us. I always, as a very simple answer, say buy domestic. Over 80% of our product does come from international sources. But domestically, it may not be perfect, but we do have pretty good regulations here in the States that a lot of countries don't. On the wild side, again, a completely different set of recommendations. Buying lower on the food chain is always a good idea. It's those large predatory fish, which are the ones that take a long time to grow, and the stocks themselves take a lot more to replenish. So again, eating lower, looking at your trouts, your mackerels, your sardines, your anchovies, again, a much better use of the wild resources. Look for certifications. There are more and more seafood certifications for sustainability out there, and you're starting to see in a lot of the big companies that we normally shop from, you'll find these certifications out there. Looking at Whole Foods, Walmart is actually involved. And again, buying domestic. Our fisheries aren't perfect, but we do a much better job than the majority of the world. Most of our fish comes from places where there is no management, and we are up there with New Zealand, Australia, and many European countries with actually managing our fisheries quite well. So a quick snapshot into the environmental work that I've been part of. We started really doing consumer awareness over 10 years ago, and that's with things like seafood watch cards and letting people know that there is an issue. And that's morphed into corporate partnerships, which is, it's been taking that same science and those same efforts and helping companies themselves deal with them. And now, I mean, we're proud to say that every single one of the major retailers in North America is involved with an environmental organization in creating and drafting their sustainable seafood policies. Now, some of them go a lot further than others, but there is the attempt to start moving towards certifications, start telling people more of the information, and start using more of this science to actually drive to more environmental repair. And the latest change, which is something that I'm very proud of our movement for getting involved in, is actually doing fishery improvement projects. And I actually just got back from a team meeting in England with a group called Sustainable Fisheries Partnerships. And they take leverage of companies like Walmart, and they actually go and fix fisheries. And for those of us who stare at computers all day up in Fort Collins, we don't get to see these changes actually happen. This is a team of people in Indonesia who has Walmart behind them that says, I will source tuna, canned tuna that comes from your fishery only if you change it. And when you have the leverage of Walmart behind you, those fishermen have to listen because the economy of their country largely depends on it. So again, it's a sort of a proud realization that through really a pretty short time frame, 10, 12 years, we've seen basically raising the awareness through organizations like Greenpeace and Monterey Bay Aquarium to the point where now we have companies like Walmart and McDonald's supporting this work actually on the ground and fixing these fisheries where it actually needs to happen. So quick resources for consumers. I always point to the Seafood Watch card. There's some on the table right as on your way in. It's really one of the best places to keep up on the best information you can find. They also have a smartphone app for both Android and iPhone. I have to admit, I use these all the time. I do this stuff all day, every day, but can't keep up with the amount of data that they have. They also update their data constantly, so their smartphone app is a really good way to have the most current science in front of you. And just a few, I promise I do not work for Whole Foods or McDonald's. I put the McDonald's logo smaller because I kind of don't like putting it up there, but I have to. To bring this locally, I mean, we're all from Colorado here. Really cool story. We talked about recirculating systems. And if you want the best piece of tilapia you've ever eaten, go buy a piece of tilapia from a Whole Foods in Colorado. And the reason I say that is because it's never left the state. It's actually farmed in a prison in Canyon City. So they're actually using inmate labor, which is brilliant because it's virtually free. They have subsidized power, subsidized electricity, subsidized water, all because it's a prison work release system. So these inmates are actually learning a vocation in the fastest growing food sector on the planet right now. And they're farming tilapia product that gets processed through their prison, goes through a distributor in Denver, and then gets distributed all across Colorado. So the rest of the tilapia you're going to get is probably going to come frozen from China. I mean, this is a product you can get right here. Another one, I have to talk about McDonald's because that filet of fish sandwich is one of the most sustainable things you can find, which is kind of scary to admit, but the last organization I just mentioned, Sustainable Fisheries Partnerships, they went to McDonald's and they said, if you don't help us fix the Alaskan pollock fishery and the North Atlantic cod fisheries, your pollock's going to cost you 5 cents more a pound in the next 10 years because it's going to be that much harder to catch. And when you tell McDonald's that something that they spend billions of dollars marketing is going to cost them 5% more in their natural resource to actually put that product together, they listen and they get things done. So that fishery is now certified by the Marine Stewardship Council, which you can see up there, and you'll actually see that MSC logo on a filet of fish box. So we may not like McDonald's. It may not be the healthiest thing in the world, but I think if you get one without the bun or the cheese or the sauce, it's one of the best fast food items you can get for the environment and for you. Just kind of sad. And the other point too, David pointed out, to bring it back to Colorado, he pointed out some of the aquaponics systems that exist. There's actually one north of Fort Collins called Quantix, and it's exactly the system that David pointed out. It's a hydroponic farm in line with a tilapia farm. And what they do is the tilapia farm's water has to be filtered on a regular basis to keep the tilapia living healthy. But that water, which is high in effluent, is actually incredibly high in nutrients as well. So all the water that comes out of that fish farm goes into the hydroponic garden and is, again, incredibly nutritious, increases their yield by something like 40%. And that naturally filters the water that then goes back into the tilapia farm. So if you go and have a salad at Jack's Seafood Restaurant, that produce has all come from the hydroponic garden, which is just north of Fort Collins. So I have to applaud Vicki for putting together Making Waves in Colorado. Like sometimes my colleagues make fun of me constantly because I live in Colorado and I do oceans work. But the realities are, I mean, we have prison tilapia, we have aquaponics tilapia and produce right here in Colorado, and we can eat it here at home and it never leaves our state. And it has this amazing, in my opinion, amazing impacts and amazing opportunities for the future. So my dream is to ditch this environmental work in about 5 years and start farming fish. I just need David's methods to be a little more economically viable by that point. So with that, I really appreciate your time and would love any kind of questions after the talk, or I mean, I'll be hanging out quite a while afterwards and would love to fill in.